You spend your days writing tickets to real mariners, Diana, so do not pretend you belong at this table when my marina passes to my son. My father-in-law sneered across the dining room, sliding a legal draft that would officially block me from the family business. He looked at my Coast Guard background and saw only a bureaucratic nuisance he could safely bully. He had no idea my signature was already on the single document that kept him out of federal bankruptcy. To understand how his empire collapsed during a sworn deposition, I have to go back. My name is Diana. I am 52 years old. For 20 years, I wore the uniform of the United States Coast Guard. Today, I work as a civilian marine safety investigator based out of Norfolk, Virginia. My job is entirely unglamorous. I do not steer massive cutters through raging storms, and I do not haul in record-breaking catches. I am the woman on the dock with the clipboard. I am the one who climbs down into sweltering, oil-stained engine rooms to trace a fuel line looking for the tiny hairline fracture that could turn a routine voyage into a fatal disaster. In my line of work, you learn very early that facts matter more than feelings. The ocean does not care about your ego, and a rusted bulkhead does not care about your profit margins. We live by a simple rule. Slow is smooth, and smooth is fast. You do not rush a safety check. When you do the quiet work correctly, nothing happens. No fires break out. No holes fail. The crews go home to their families. I carried that exact same steady, disciplined mindset into my marriage. Mark is the anchor of my life. He is brilliant, patient, and completely dedicated to the coastal community where we live. His family owns a massive historic marina that stretches along a prime piece of deep-water real estate in the Chesapeake Bay. For 3 generations, his family has managed the slip rentals, the winter storage, and the sprawling boat repair yard that keeps the local commercial fleet running. Mark managed the complex logistics and the finances. His father, Arthur, managed the ego. Arthur is a loud, barrel-chested man who believes volume is the ultimate substitute for authority. To Arthur, the world is divided into 2 distinct groups. There are the real men, the ones who turn wrenches, shout at deckhands, and bend the rules to keep the boats moving. And then there are the obstacles. From the first day Mark brought me down to the docks, Arthur decided I was an obstacle. He looked at my uniform and later my civilian credentials and saw a threat. He hated regulators. He despised anyone who told him how to safely run his business, and he particularly hated hearing it from a female inspector. During family gatherings, he would purposely tell loud stories about how he outsmarted environmental auditors or ignored safety mandates to get a trawler back in the water a day early. He would look directly at me while he spoke, waiting for me to take the bait. I never argued. Not because I was intimidated, but because arguing with a man like Arthur is like trying to empty the ocean with a teacup. Sometimes you fight back. Sometimes you just drink your coffee, hold your husband by the hand, and let him talk. I knew who I was. I had my own career, and I was perfectly happy to let him run his empire his way. But tolerance is often mistaken for weakness. Arthur saw my calm demeanor and assumed I was a coward. He assumed I was just a tired paper pusher who would eventually fold. If you have ever had to deal with a family member who mistakes your patience for weakness, tell me how you handled it in the comments below. As the years passed, Arthur reached his late 70s. His health began to slip, and the inevitable question of succession became a daily topic. Mark was his only child. He knew the business better than his father did. It was an established fact that the marina would eventually pass to him. That was when his quiet disdain turned into an active, aggressive campaign to erase me. He could not stomach the idea of a safety inspector having even a tangential connection to his legacy. Under state property laws, as Mark's wife, I would naturally share in the future stability of our household. Arthur decided he needed to build a fortress to keep me out. It started with small exclusions. He would physically block me from entering the maintenance bays when I came to pick Mark up from work. Then the financial paranoia began. Mark noticed a sudden frantic shift in his father's behavior. Arthur hired a new corporate law firm from the city. He began demanding audits of the holding company. Why was he rushing through paperwork at a speed that made absolutely no sense for a man who usually procrastinated on legal matters? The answer came during a Tuesday night dinner. We had barely finished our meal when Arthur stood up, walked to his study, and returned with a thick, cream-colored envelope. He tossed it onto the table between Mark and me. It landed with a heavy thud, rattling our water glasses. It was a drafted legal restructuring agreement. The terms were staggering. The document explicitly and legally severed me from ever holding shares voting rights or even a basic advisory role in the family business. It was an ironclad wall, designed to keep me completely isolated. "Sign it by Friday," Arthur demanded, his voice flat and cold. "Or the marina goes to a corporate buyer, and you get nothing, Mark." He smirked across the table. The silence at the dinner table the night before had only emboldened my father-in-law. When a man relies on volume to win a fight, a quiet refusal feels like a profound insult. He wanted me to argue so he could prove to Mark that I was emotionally unfit. When I did not, he decided to force the issue in public. The very next morning, the escalation began on the docks. I had taken a personal day to help a friend haul his wooden skiff out of the water at the far end of the boatyard. Mark was in the main office, organizing payroll. Arthur drove his maintenance cart directly to our slip. He parked, crossed his arms, and raised his voice loud enough for the entire maintenance crew to hear over the deep diesel hum of the travel lift. "Make sure you keep clear of the heavy machinery today, Diana," he called out, a mocking smile on his weathered face. "We are moving real assets here. We would not want you getting confused and trying to write us a safety ticket. Leave the actual work to the men who own the yard." The mechanics shifted uncomfortably. A few of the dockhands paused their work to watch. It was a clumsy, desperate attempt to assert dominance. He was practically vibrating with adrenaline. He was waiting for me to lose my temper to shout back, to give him the explosive reaction he needed to justify his aggressive legal maneuver. Silence. I secured the bowline on my friend's skiff, checked the knot, and turned around. "Understood, Arthur," I said mildly. "We will stay out of your way." I walked away. I could feel his disappointment burning into my back. In my line of work, you learn how to read an escalating situation. When a ship captain starts screaming at an inspector about a routine delay, it is almost never about the delay. It is about something he is hiding below the deck. Panic is a byproduct of structural weakness. Arthur's sudden cruelty was not strength. It was desperation. He was moving too fast. He was demanding signatures on a Friday for a legal restructure that had not even been properly vetted. I needed to understand the mechanics of his panic. Later that afternoon, Mark and I sat on our back porch. He was exhausted, staring out at the water. He wanted to hire our own lawyer and fight the restructuring document line by line. "Hold on," I told him quietly. "Look at the timeline. He has hated my career for a decade, but he only started moving on this legal block a few weeks ago. Something triggered this. What is happening at the marina right now?" Mark frowned, thinking. He managed the daily operations, but Arthur strictly controlled the historical records and the overarching corporate liability policies. "The commercial insurance is up for a mandatory 10-year federal audit at the end of the month," he said slowly. "It is a massive review. The underwriters are sending a team to comb through our entire valuation history." There it was. The weak point in the hull. Arthur was rushing to restructure the ownership before the insurance auditors arrived. He wanted a legally binding firewall in place to ensure that when the business transferred to Mark, I would have zero legal standing to look at the corporate books or ask questions about the property's history. "Call Paul," I said, referencing the trusted, quiet accountant Mark used for his personal tax filings. "Do not ask Arthur for permission. Just have Paul pull the marina's historical insurance files from the state archive. I want to see the valuation history for the last 20 years. Mark made the call. For the next 3 days, I went back to my civilian office in Norfolk. I reviewed ship manifests. I inspected bulkheads. I let Arthur believe he had completely intimidated me. The man thought he had me cornered. Therefore, he stopped paying attention. Overconfident men always leave a trail because they assume the people they look down on are too stupid to check the map. On Thursday afternoon, Paul, the accountant, called. His voice was hushed, almost nervous. He asked me to meet him at his quiet carpeted office in town, far away from the docks. When I arrived, Paul was locking his office door. A heavy cardboard banker's box sat on his desk. "I pulled the historicals from the state repository, Diana," Paul said, offering me a cup of coffee. "You were right to ask. The valuation is completely unstable." Paul explained that for decades the marina had steadily grown in value. But exactly 15 years ago, the property valuation plummeted by almost 40%. It was a massive, sudden financial hit. "What caused the drop?" I asked. Paul leaned closer. "I do not know the specifics. Arthur always claimed it was a minor market downturn, but the math never added up. Right after the valuation dropped, Arthur personally fired his old operations manager for asking questions about a specific file." Paul reached into the cardboard box and pulled out a faded red accordion folder. The edges were worn, and the string tie was frayed. "This is the only file Arthur kept completely separated from the main corporate ledger," Paul whispered. "He hid it in a dead storage unit. I only found it because the state repository cross-referenced an old canceled insurance claim number." He pushed the heavy box toward me. "Take it," Paul warned, looking directly at me. "But be careful. That red folder is the exact reason the last guy was fired. I do not know what Arthur buried inside it, but he treats it like a loaded weapon." I looked down at the red folder resting on top of the archived documents. I brought the heavy cardboard box back to our house, setting it gently on the kitchen table. The house was completely quiet. Mark was still at the marina office trying to manage the chaos his father had created. I brewed a strong pot of dark roast coffee, turned on the small overhead light, and pulled up a chair. In the Coast Guard, an investigation requires you to strip away the noise and focus entirely on the physical evidence. You do not assume guilt, and you do not assume innocence. You follow the paper trail. When a commercial vessel sinks, it is rarely a sudden, unpredictable act of nature. It is almost always the final link in a long chain of arrogant decisions. Someone ignored a rusted bulkhead. Someone skipped a mandatory safety check to save a few dollars. If you want to understand the wreckage, you have to find the very first weak link. I did not open the red folder immediately. First, I needed to establish a baseline. For 2 hours, I carefully reviewed the marina's standard financial history. Paul, the accountant, was absolutely right. The business had grown steadily for decades, showing healthy profit margins. Then, exactly 15 years ago, the numbers abruptly fell off a cliff. The company valuation plummeted by 40% in a single fiscal quarter. It was a massive financial hemorrhage that Arthur had always publicly blamed on a slow local economy and a bad fishing season. That was a lie. I pushed the general ledgers aside and finally reached for the faded red accordion folder. The string tie broke in my hands, brittle with age. I opened it. The air inside smelled like old dust and panic. It was a chaotic, disorganized stack of internal damage reports, frantic legal correspondence, and severe notices from a major commercial insurance underwriter. I began to arrange the documents chronologically across the kitchen table. As I examined the initial incident reports, the truth behind the sudden valuation drop became terrifyingly clear. 15 years ago, long before I had ever met Mark, the marina had nearly burned to the waterline. According to the local fire marshal's report included in the file, a spark from a grinding wheel in the main repair bay had ignited a large pool of leaked marine diesel. The fire roared out of control, jumping from the dock planks to a dry-docked commercial trawler. It was the exact nightmare scenario every marine safety investigator dreads. The flames had moved dangerously near to the marina's primary underground fuel storage tanks. If those massive subterranean tanks had ignited, the resulting chemical explosion would have leveled the entire boatyard. It would have destroyed millions of dollars in commercial vessels, caused a devastating environmental disaster in the Chesapeake Bay, and likely killed anyone standing on the docks. The local fire departments barely managed to contain the blaze, stopping it mere yards from the primary fuel valves. The structural damage to the infrastructure was immense, requiring hundreds of thousands of dollars in emergency repairs. That explained the massive financial dip, but it did not explain the survival of the business. I scanned the panicked letters Arthur's old attorneys had sent to the insurance underwriter in the days following the fire. The insurance company was furious. Their independent adjusters had found gross negligence. The initial fuel leak was caused by rotting lines and ignored maintenance schedules. Arthur had been cutting corners to maximize his profit margins. The underwriter sent a formal notice of intent to cancel the commercial policy completely. In the maritime industry, losing your commercial liability coverage after a negligence-caused fire is an immediate death sentence. Without insurance, the state pulls your operating license. Without a license, the banks call in your commercial loans. The owners of the damaged trawlers would have sued Arthur directly, stripping the family of every asset they owned. 15 years ago, the marina should have been wiped off the map. Arthur should have faced total bankruptcy, yet he was still here. The business had survived. I leaned back in my chair and took a sip of my coffee. Why did the insurance provider allow the marina to keep their coverage despite the massive negligence involved in the fire? Commercial underwriters do not operate on charity or mercy. They operate on strict compliance metrics and calculated risk. They had him dead to rights on negligence. Something monumental must have forced them to honor the policy. Arthur had spent his entire life bragging about his independent business acumen, but this was not a clever financial maneuver. This was survival on a technicality. I sifted through the remaining pages in the red folder, searching for the mitigating factor. There were pages deliberately removed from the timeline. Arthur had clearly tried to scrub the file clean, but overconfident men always leave a trail. I reached the very bottom of the red folder. Pressed flat beneath a rigid piece of cardboard, I found a thin, pink piece of carbon paper. It had slipped between the cardboard flaps, completely overlooked by whoever had hastily purged the file a decade earlier. I carefully pulled the pink paper out and smoothed it flat under the warm glow of the kitchen light. It was not an internal corporate memo. It was a formal federal document. I checked the date stamped at the top of the page. It was filed exactly 3 weeks before the near-miss fire. The document was a rigid safety mandate. It outlined a severe infraction regarding the marina's primary containment barriers, ordering a mandatory immediate fuel system overhaul. It legally forced Arthur to install heavy-duty emergency shutoff valves before the marina was allowed to pump another drop of fuel. I stared at the pink carbon copy. This federal mandate was the only reason the insurance company had not dropped him. Someone had legally forced him to fix the exact system that saved the docks from total destruction. I moved my finger down to the very bottom of the page, searching for the inspecting officer's signature block. The faded black ink caught the harsh glare of the kitchen light. I read the formal signature of the Coast Guard investigating officer who had forced the emergency shutdown of the marina's fuel pumps. The name written on the line was Diana. My last name followed it. I sat back in my chair. The quiet hum of the refrigerator suddenly seemed deafening. The realization washed over me like cold water over a ship's bow. 15 years ago, I was a 25-year-old junior officer attached to a regional Marine safety detachment. It was long before I had ever met Mark. Long before I had ever sat at Arthur's dining room table. I had been conducting routine commercial compliance checks along the Chesapeake Bay. To me, this sprawling marina was just another set of geographic coordinates on a long list of weekly inspections. I vaguely remembered a hostile, barrel-chested marina owner who had screamed at me from the docks as I locked out his primary fuel lines. He was furious that I was interfering with his profit margins during peak season. He had called me a bureaucratic nuisance, completely ignorant of how a real business functioned. He had threatened to call my sector commander and have me fired. That furious man was Arthur. I was the young, rigid inspector who had forced him to upgrade his containment barriers. When the catastrophic fire broke out exactly 3 weeks later, Arthur's negligence started the blaze. The fire roared across the wooden planks driven by leaked marine diesel, heading straight for the primary underground tanks. But it never reached them. The heavy-duty emergency shutoff valves, the exact valves I had legally forced him to install under threat of federal closure, triggered instantly. They starved the fire of its ultimate fuel source. My strict, uncompromising safety ticket was the physical barrier that stopped his total annihilation. But it did not just save the physical infrastructure. It saved the business from total financial ruin. I looked at the frantic correspondence between Arthur's old attorneys and the insurance underwriters. The puzzle pieces finally snapped together. The insurance company maintained coverage because the federal mandate forced the marina into legal compliance right before the disaster struck. Arthur's corporate lawyers had used my inspection report as an impenetrable legal shield. They successfully argued to the insurance adjusters that because Arthur had just completed the mandatory federal upgrades, the facility was actively meeting safety standards when the fire occurred. The insurance company was legally backed into a corner. They had to honor the policy, paying out hundreds of thousands of dollars in emergency repairs. My strict report saved the docks. My signature saved his entire empire. For 15 years, Arthur had carefully hidden this fact. He had built his identity on the myth that he had single-handedly steered his family business through its darkest hour. He could never admit to his peers, or his son, that his survival was owed entirely to a regulatory safety ticket written by a young woman. He had purged the ledgers, fired the manager who asked questions, and buried the red folder in a dead storage unit to protect his fragile ego. When Mark first brought me down to the docks 10 years ago, Arthur must have recognized my name or my uniform. The realization that he owed his entire legacy to the regulator he despised must have terrified him. He spent a decade trying to belittle my career, projecting his massive insecurity to ensure I never looked closely at his history. And now, with a mandatory 10-year insurance audit approaching, he was terrified the truth would be exposed. He was rushing a legal firewall to permanently sever my access to the company before I could ever accidentally discover it. He wanted to lock me out of the family legacy, completely unaware that I was the very foundation it was currently sitting on. I carefully folded the pink carbon copy and slid it into my wallet. How will Arthur's aggressive legal strategy hold up against undeniable federal proof? I knew the answer. It would not. But I did not feel a rush of triumph. I felt a cold, sharp clarity. In my line of work, facts always win over feelings. You do not argue with a man who is actively sinking his own ship. You just secure the evidence. Just then, the front door rattled. Mark walked into the hallway, dropping his keys on the counter. He looked completely drained. The stress of managing the business while his father actively tried to tear our marriage apart was taking a heavy toll. Before he could take off his coat, heavy footsteps echoed on the front wooden porch. The doorbell rang loud and sharp in the quiet evening air. I walked to the door and opened it. A man in a cheap gray suit stood on the welcome mat holding a thick manila envelope. He did not look at me. He looked down at a piece of paper in his hand. "Are you Diana?" he asked. "Yes," I replied. He shoved the envelope hard against my chest. "You have been served." He turned and walked quickly back to a running sedan parked on the street. Mark came up behind me as I opened the envelope. Inside was a formal legal summons drafted by Arthur's expensive downtown law firm. It was a subpoena. Arthur was no longer just asking for my signature on a restructure draft. He was taking this to court. The summons ordered me to appear for a formal, hostile deposition regarding the ownership dispute of the family business. He intended to put me on the legal record. He wanted his lawyers to question me under oath to officially categorize me as an outsider with zero historical or financial ties to the company, proving I was legally unfit to maintain any future connection to the marina. He wanted to humiliate me in a sterile room in front of his attorneys, cementing his control, just days before the federal auditors arrived. "Let him try," I said softly, folding the heavy legal summons and placing it back into its envelope. Mark looked at me, completely bewildered by my calm reaction. He had expected me to match his anger, to shout about the injustice of a hostile deposition, or to immediately dial a ruthless defense attorney to countersue. In most families, a process server showing up at your front door is a declaration of total war. But my training took over. A legal deposition is not a shouting match on a wooden dock. It is a highly controlled procedural environment governed by strict, inflexible rules of evidence. It is a room where volume means absolutely nothing and documentation means everything. It was exactly where I wanted to be. I did not explain what I had found in the brittle red folder. I simply asked him to trust me and to keep managing the marina's daily operations. I needed him insulated from the explosive secret his father had been hiding for 15 years. The next morning, I drove down to the Regional Coast Guard Administrative Archives in Portsmouth. The pink carbon copy I carried in my wallet was a solid clue, but in a hostile legal setting, a carbon copy is easily disputed. An aggressive corporate lawyer will claim it was tampered with or lack proper chain of custody. I needed the undeniable, unalterable federal record. Because I maintained high-level security clearance as a civilian investigator, I had direct access to the historical archives. I sat with a senior records clerk, a retired chief petty officer who understood the exact weight of my request. Using my old badge number and the specific date I found on the carbon copy, I requested the comprehensive master file for my old inspection route. I needed the original, unredacted incident report I had filed against Arthur's marina. An hour later, the clerk returned with a heavy sealed folder. Inside was the complete paper trail. It contained my initial safety violation notice, the mandatory compliance order forcing Arthur to install emergency fuel shutoff valves, and the strict timeline proving he had executed the upgrades just weeks before the catastrophic fire. At the bottom of the final page, beneath the official seal of the United States Coast Guard, was my clear, unbroken signature. I requested 3 certified copies, each officially stamped with raised ink. They were legally bulletproof. No high-priced downtown attorney could argue against them. I took the certified documents, placed them into a simple manila folder, and went back to my normal routine. For the next 4 days leading up to the deposition, I maintained absolute discipline. I did not call Arthur to brag. I did not storm down to the boatyard to wave the documents in his face and demand an apology. My quiet investigator, discipline, the absolute reliance on facts over feelings, proved far superior to Arthur's loud, emotional tactics. I simply let him steer his ship directly into the storm. Arthur, meanwhile, mistook my silence for complete capitulation. He assumed I was too terrified by his legal threats to mount a defense. Mark told me his father's confidence reached a fever pitch. He swaggered around the maintenance bays, loudly bragging to the mechanics and the dock hands that he was finally excising the dead weight from the family. He framed my impending legal defeat as a massive personal victory, a necessary purge to protect real mariners from a useless paper pusher. He thought he was building an impenetrable fortress. Will the family's own attorney realize his client is walking into a massive legal trap? Arthur had hired a notorious, highly aggressive corporate lawyer from the city. The man charged massive hourly fees to bully opponents into submission, but an attorney is only as powerful as the facts his client provides. Arthur had spent 15 years lying to his son, his employees, and his insurance company. Now, to protect his own fragile ego, he was intentionally lying to his legal counsel. He had handed his lawyer a loaded weapon, completely unaware that the barrel was pointed backward. The morning of the deposition arrived with a cold, overcast sky. Mark and I drove into the city in total silence. We parked in a deep underground garage and rode the glass elevator up to the 40th floor of a towering corporate law firm. The lobby smelled of expensive leather and bitter coffee. We were led down a long hallway and into a sleek, expansive conference room. One wall was entirely glass, overlooking the gray waters of the harbor below. A long, polished mahogany table dominated the space. A certified court reporter sat quietly in the corner, her hands resting over the keys of a stenography machine, ready to permanently record every word spoken. Arthur was already sitting at the head of the table. He looked absolutely triumphant. He wore a crisp, expensive suit flanked by two sharp-looking corporate attorneys. His lead lawyer was arranging thick stacks of intimidating legal binders, completely confident in his upcoming victory. Arthur did not stand when we entered. He did not offer a polite greeting. He simply leaned back in his leather chair and smirked. He genuinely believed this was his victory lap. He thought he was about to permanently erase my name from the family legacy, securing his empire just days before the federal auditors arrived to review his sanitized history. I held my simple manila folder tightly as Mark and I stepped into the sleek downtown conference room, taking our seats directly across from Arthur and his smirking legal team. The head attorney adjusted his silk tie, cleared his throat, and signaled for the court reporter to begin. The room fell silent, except for the rapid, quiet clicking of the stenography machine. We were officially on the legal record. Everything spoken in this room was now sworn testimony. The attorney leaned forward, folding his hands on top of a massive stack of binders. He looked at me with a practiced, condescending stare. For the first 20 minutes, he asked aggressive, pointed questions designed to frame me as a total outsider. He asked for the exact dates I became involved in the family's financial decisions. I answered, simply confirming I held no formal title. He asked if I had ever personally swung a hammer to repair a commercial vessel on their property. I answered no. Arthur watched this process with absolute glee. He nodded along, looking over at Mark as if to say, "Look at the useless woman you married." He genuinely believed this sterile room would be the venue where he finally erased me from his life. Then the lawyer moved in for the final, brutal summary statement. He wanted to permanently capture my lack of contribution. "So, Diana, we have established on the legal record that you have contributed no financial capital to this business," the lawyer stated smoothly, his voice rising in volume. "You have contributed no physical labor to its operation. Your career as a federal inspector, writing minor regulatory tickets to actual working mariners, provides zero functional value to the family's legacy. Therefore, you have absolutely no standing to dispute the proposed permanent restructure. Is that an accurate summary?" Before I could answer, Arthur leaned heavily into the microphone, his face flushed with triumph. He could not resist the urge to dominate the narrative. "She is a useless ticket writer," Arthur sneered for the transcript. "She has never contributed a single dime or a drop of sweat to my family's survival. She spends her days harassing real businessmen. My son manages the books, and I built the entire physical infrastructure. I saved this marina through sheer sweat and business acumen when a massive fire nearly destroyed us 15 years ago. This woman has no historical claim. I want her permanently locked out." The attorney nodded approvingly. It was a vicious, calculated statement designed to completely marginalize me. "Is my client's assessment accurate?" the lawyer asked, a smug smile forming. "Have you ever made a material foundational contribution to the survival of this business?" I did not argue. I did not shout back at Arthur. I simply reached into my plain manila folder. I pulled out the 3 certified copies of the unredacted federal safety mandate. I kept one for myself. I slid the second copy across the polished mahogany table directly to Arthur. I pushed the third copy over to his head attorney. "I believe my contribution is documented," I said calmly. "I suggest you review page 4. The attorney picked up the thick, raised ink document. He frowned. This was not the financial surrender he had expected. He flipped quickly to the 4th page. I watched his eyes scan the text. I watched his confident smirk vanish entirely. The silence in the room stretched out, heavy and suffocating. The stenographer paused, waiting for someone to speak. "What is this?" Arthur demanded. He grabbed his copy but refused to look at it, staring instead at his lawyer, demanding an explanation. The attorney's face drained of color. He was an aggressive lawyer, but he was not stupid. He instantly recognized the catastrophic legal weight of a certified federal record contradicting his client's sworn testimony. He studied the mandatory compliance order forcing Arthur to install emergency fuel shutoff valves. He saw the timeline proving those upgrades happened 3 weeks before the near-miss fire. He saw the unalterable Coast Guard seal. Then the lawyer looked down at the signature block. He looked up at me. Then he looked at a very confused Arthur. "Arthur," the lawyer asked, his voice suddenly sharp and tight, "did you ever disclose to my firm that your entire insurance payout 15 years ago was contingent upon a federal safety mandate?" "What?" Arthur barked. "No, I saved the yard. I managed the upgrades." The lawyer slowly placed the document flat on the table, turning it around so Arthur could see the bottom line. He tapped a manicured finger directly on the signature block. "Speak the inspecting officer's name out loud," the lawyer commanded. Arthur squinted at the paper. His bravado fractured instantly. The color drained from his weathered face, leaving him pale and completely still. He stared at my signature. He realized that the useless paper pusher he had spent 10 years mocking, the woman he was currently trying to legally destroy in a sworn deposition, was the exact person who had forced him to install the safety valves that stopped the fire. My strict report was the only reason his insurance policy had paid out. Without my signature, he would have been bankrupt and sued into oblivion 15 years ago. The room was absolutely silent. The stenography machine stopped. When Arthur refused to speak, the family's own attorney spoke the inspecting officer's signature out loud for the legal record. Arthur's entire framing crumbled instantly. The illusion of his independent empire shattered into 1,000 undeniable pieces. He owed his legacy, his wealth, and his son's inheritance entirely to the regulatory discipline he violently despised. The lawyer realized his client was actively committing perjury regarding the historical foundation of the business. The attorney stopped, the court reporter shut his folder, and turned to a pale Arthur to ask why they were trying to legally destroy the woman who saved their company. Arthur had absolutely no answer. The heavy, barrel-chested man who had always relied on volume to dominate a room was completely stripped of his voice. He sat at the head of the polished table, staring blankly at the certified federal document. He looked like a man who had spent his entire life building a massive stone fortress, only to realize he had built it entirely on top of an active fault line. The high-priced attorney did not wait for a response. Corporate lawyers do not tolerate clients who actively lie to them and deliberately withhold catastrophic liability history, especially when a massive 10-year federal insurance audit is less than a month away. The lawyer stood up, packed his heavy leather briefcase with swift, angry motions, and officially withdrew the hostile restructuring draft on the legal record. He advised Arthur in very stark terms that pursuing any further legal action to alienate me from the family would open up a devastating countersuit. He left his humiliated client sitting in absolute silence, effectively firing Arthur before he even reached the elevator. The deposition was abruptly canceled. The high-priced legal attack was completely broken. Mark and I walked out of the sleek downtown building together. We left Arthur sitting entirely alone in the silent conference room, staring at the raised ink of the Coast Guard seal. Over the next few weeks, the atmosphere at the marina shifted permanently. The frantic rush to lock me out of the family legacy evaporated. Because I held the original certified copies of the compliance reports, I sat down with Paul the accountant and Mark to properly organize the historical paperwork. When the federal insurance auditors arrived at the end of the month, they reviewed the meticulously documented timeline. They saw that the safety upgrades had been legally enforced and completed before the fire. The commercial liability policy was secured for another 10 years. The family business was safe. Arthur's reaction to his defeat was not explosive anger. It was a profound, deeply uncomfortable humility. He was permanently sidelined by his own hubris. The mechanics and the dockhands who had heard his loud bragging about excising the dead weight watched as he quietly retreated from daily operations. He stopped shouting orders from his maintenance cart. He stopped trying to publicly humiliate me. The realization that his entire legacy was anchored entirely by the strict discipline of a female regulatory inspector broke the fragile ego he had spent a lifetime defending. He knew, and the entire family now knew, exactly who had saved the docks. Many people assumed I would use my massive legal leverage to seize financial control of the marina. With Arthur's deception exposed, I could have easily demanded controlling shares out of spite or forced him into complete exile from the property he built. That is what a petty person would have done. That is what a person who operates on emotion rather than discipline would have chosen. But I am a Coast Guard investigator. Our mission is to ensure stability, safety, and a smooth passage home. We do not issue tickets out of vengeance. We issue them to enforce boundaries and keep the ship afloat. Taking over a business I had absolutely no desire to run would have been a purely emotional reaction. I did not press for revenge. I simply enforced a strict, unbreakable boundary. I asked only to be treated with absolute respect and to be recognized as an equal partner in my own marriage, sharing in the family legacy alongside my husband. Mark assumed full operational control of the marina. Arthur quietly stepped back, spending his remaining years in a much smaller advisory role, completely stripped of his hostile authority. He never made another disparaging comment about my career. I went back to my unglamorous civilian job in Norfolk. I continued walking the docks, inspecting bulkheads, and looking for hairline fractures in commercial fuel lines. I am proud to be a bureaucratic nuisance. Sometimes, the most important work in the world is the work nobody wants to do. Sometimes, the quietest person at the table is the only reason the house is still standing. True strength does not require volume. It does not require a sprawling empire or a massive audience to prove its worth. Overconfident people will always attempt to build fortresses out of loud accusations and aggressive bluster. But those fortresses are built on sand. When someone relies on noise to protect a fragile ego, they eventually forget how to check their own foundations. You do not need to shout back. You do not need to match their frantic energy. You simply secure your foundation, prepare your evidence, and let them sail their fragile ego directly into the storm. When the water gets deep, the truth always rises to the surface. Not because they finally admit they were wrong, but because the facts simply leave them no other choice. If this story resonated with you, and you believe that quiet discipline will always defeat loud arrogance, I would deeply appreciate it if you hit the subscribe button. It helps me share more stories about people finding quiet strength and demanding the respect they have earned. Before you go, tell me in the comments below, how do you handle a toxic family member who constantly underestimates your worth? I read every single one. Thank you for listening, and I will see you in the next one, where a wealthy executive assumes she can buy her way out of a contract, completely unaware she is dealing with a seasoned forensic accountant.